Okay. Thank you very much for those warm words and the warm welcome. It really is a pleasure to come back to Maynooth for this important conference on climate justice. And I'd like to thank the three organisers, Trocaire, Maynooth University and St. Patrick's College. Thank you. I think I'm a bit moved. But one thing Eamon left out of that very long list is that I'm also a grandmother. And I was really very taken by the poem by Elise, Our Mistake, a great poem. I'm glad you won the primary section. And also the commitment of both Amy and Andrew. That's great to hear because that's what we need. That's what we need more of. So I was really very, very happy to hear you. I also want to acknowledge a debt to Maynooth. I came here several years ago, not the time of the fire problem, but very shortly after my foundation, the May Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, was established, because I'm not a scientist and I had a lot to learn. And I came here with Dr. Tara Shine, who's actually with me again today. She is a climate scientist and good on development, etc. But I came and I sat at the feet of Professor John Sweeney and a number of very able presenters who gave us a sort of crash course on science and, in particular, on the need to address the challenge to humanity of what was happening because of the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'm glad that this conference is taking place in a university that has taken the science of climate change so seriously over a long number of years. And already there has been reference to the very good timing, and it is, I must say, excellent, because we're still reflecting on Laudato Si, care for our common home, and the challenge that Pope Francis has called us all to, I think. I particularly hope that those negotiators who are in their tortuous negotiations will take time out and just read and reflect on the encyclical, because I think that will help them immensely. As the title of the conference, From Evidence to Action, suggests, we do have the evidence. It shouldn't be disputed that the climate is changing and that human beings are largely responsible for the changes. The 10 warmest years since records began in the 19th century have all been since 1997, and 2014 was the Earth's hottest year on record. Last May was the hottest May on record. The 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released in 2014, identified that warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and the actions taken by the world to date to limit climate change have been grossly inadequate. Governments have agreed to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Recent work under the UNFCCC to review that goal shows that 2 degrees is a defence line rather than a safe limit, and points to the need to reorient towards a 1.5 degree limit to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Science tells us we are far off track to meet even the goal to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, if we continue business as usual, we're on a track to a 4 degree warmer world compared with pre-industrial levels. A World Bank study a couple of years ago called Turn Down the Heat described a 4 degree warmer world as catastrophic, with extreme and potentially irreversible impacts. It will alter life on Earth as we know it. What does staying below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius mean in practice? What exactly does it mean? The latest science makes it clear that the world needs to reach zero carbon emissions globally by 2050 to maximise the chances of staying below 2 degrees Celsius and to make 1.5 degrees Celsius feasible. To do this, 2/3 of the known fossil fuel reserves must be left in the ground and alternative sources of clean energy embraced. To be fair, all countries must be enabled to participate in the transition away from fossil fuels together and at the same time. And this is something that was quite a surprise to me, but we carried out some research and produced a paper called Zero Carbon, Zero Poverty, the Climate Justice Way. And that research showed that the impacts of climate change would be far worse for developing countries than the efforts they will make to get to a emissions-free world. In other words, to get to a renewable energy world, the efforts we all would have to make. No country so far has developed without fossil fuels. So we're asking developing countries to meet their sustainable development goals without using fossil fuels. In other words, that they will have to develop using a different model to that which made the industrialized countries wealthy. This can only be achieved in developing countries if they are supported with the necessary climate finance, investment and transfer of technology to make this transition. And what we found in the research, Zero Carbon, Zero Poverty, the Climate Justice Way, was that climate action and high quality growth are not just compatible, but that climate action is necessary for long-term prosperity. Every country has to be ambitious about what it will do. Every country has to do its utmost from now on in order to reach the renewable energy that is necessary. Investing in renewable energy in developing countries shouldn't be seen as a form of development aid, but as necessary for human solidarity and our common self-interest, without which we cannot achieve the goal of staying below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. We need to rethink how we approach the idea of the way in which developing countries should now develop. Most of the development will be in developing countries, and they have to be enabled through finance and transfer of technology to leapfrog into a clean technology, rather like the mobile phone, where developing countries didn't need landlines. They were able to leap into that connectivity. And let's not forget the injustice of climate change. For many people, typically the most vulnerable, their tipping point has already come. In Geneva, in early March, I participated on a panel at the Human Rights Council with President Tong of the Republic of Kiribati. He described vividly the threat to his people's very ability to remain on their islands because of the threat posed by climate change. He's bought land in Fiji as a precaution to allow for what he calls migration with dignity. But if they have to move, what becomes of the identity, the sovereignty, and the heritage of a small island people? As President Tong puts it, climate change for us as low-lying islands is no longer a future event. It's happening now. It's not something that Eleanor Roosevelt and her Commission of Human Rights ever envisaged, that human activity might cause whole nations to go out of existence. It's a concept that would have been unimaginable in 1948 when the Commission drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I came to climate change not as a scientist or an environmental law expert, but from a justice and equality perspective. And I have to admit that when I had the honour to serve as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002, climate change wasn't front of my mind. Somebody else in the UN was dealing with that, and I didn't make the connection between climate change and human rights. It was after that when I set up a small organisation called Realising Rights and was working on economic and social rights in African countries and also serving as honorary president of Oxfam International that I began to see directly the impacts of climate change firsthand. I met farmers, most of them women, unable to produce a harvest because the growing seasons had become so unreliable. The rains came at the wrong time, or there was a long period of drought and then flash flooding. And heads of state in African countries unable to plan their infrastructure development because of the impacts of floods and storms or drought. Everything seemed to be getting more difficult, despite the efforts to eradicate poverty and to make progress on the Millennium Development Goals. Climate change was the added complicating factor. I came to see the devastating impact that the effects of climate change was having on the most vulnerable, owing to factors such as geography, poverty, gender, age, indigenous or minority status, and disability. In fact, for women in vulnerable situations, climate change impacts can be particularly devastating. In many homes around the world, women are at the heart of the household's nexus of water, food and energy, and thus often know firsthand about the challenges and potential solutions in these areas. In conversations with women around the world, we hear about their struggles, but also their ideas, many of which, if applied, could facilitate change. Women are the most convincing advocates for the solutions that are needed, so they should be at the forefront of decision making, which is why we champion women's leadership in our work on climate justice. Climate change is, I believe, not just an issue of atmospheric science, it's also about human rights. Climate change is, as UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon put it recently here in Ireland, the defining issue of our time. It is a moral issue, it is an issue of social justice, human rights and fundamental ethics. I came to climate justice because for me it embodies both parts of a moral argument. To act on climate change being on the side of those who are suffering and suffering most, while also ensuring that they don't suffer again in the world as the world takes action on climate change. We have a definition in our foundation of climate justice, and I'll just read it to you. Climate justice links human rights and development to achieve a human-centred approach, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its resolution equitably and fairly. Climate justice is informed by science, responds to science, and acknowledges the need for equitable stewardship of the world's resources. So I'd like to discuss for a few moments why climate justice can enhance the global response to climate change, leading to better results for people and planet. Firstly, it provides the moral imperative to act. This has been stated eloquently by Pope Francis, and I quote him, "Today we have to realise that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor." End quote. We have a moral duty to act motivated by the injustice of the impacts of climate change on the rights and opportunities of the people who are least responsible for causing the problem. As some of you have already said, the climate challenge is immense. To deal with it demands global cooperation on an unprecedented scale, a whole new era of solidarity, based on an understanding of our interconnectedness. Perhaps more than any other problem humanity has faced, climate change confronts us with the reality of our own interdependence. No country alone can protect its citizens from the impacts of dangerous climate change. Climate change observes no boundaries. Therefore, solving the problem requires countries and citizens to act in solidarity, motivated by enlightened and collective self-interest for a better future. Solidarity is at the core of climate justice. And as I listened to the two young people, Amy and Andrew, I was struck by the fact that in Ireland we've always had this wonderful idea of the spirit of meitheal. Is our scachachéile a warren nadini. It is in each other's shadow that we flourish. And that idea of meitheal is very like Ubuntu in Africa. And maybe we need to develop a culture of a spirit of meitheal, a spirit of Ubuntu, in order to tackle this problem. And the world has shown solidarity before. In 1945, after 2 world wars, a Holocaust, and the dropping of nuclear weapons on Japan, it would come together to adopt the Charter of the United Nations, to create the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and to provide a Marshall Plan to restore a devastated Europe. A few years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. Secondly, effective climate actions need to be based on a human rights framework. A human rights framing to the Paris Agreement communicates that climate change is a human issue and that people-centred responses will be most effective. Without attention to human rights, climate policies and actions can have unintended negative impacts on people's lives, where, for example, they lose access to their land or are excluded from decision-making. We know that the risks to human rights from climate impacts would be far more significant than the risks associated with a rapid phase-out of carbon emissions. However, this doesn't negate the need to ensure that all actions seek to address human rights and ensure a just transition. Thirdly, a climate justice response will ensure that no one is left behind as we make the transition to a low-carbon economy. The world needs to ensure that the costs and the benefits of the transition away from fossil fuels are shared equitably, and that the 3 billion or so people who lack electricity or clean cook stoves are prioritised with access to known off-grid technologies that can provide them with renewable energy. We continue to live in a world of vast inequalities. Recent research by Oxfam shows that the share of the world's wealth owned by the best off 1% has increased from 44% in 2009 to 48% in 2014, while the least well-off 80% currently own just 5.5%. 7 out of 10 people live in countries where the gap between rich and poor is greater than it was 30 years ago. We need to learn, as the Pope has reminded us, to live differently, to produce differently, and to consume differently. Pope Francis has emphasised the transformative change needed because of the existential threat of the impacts of climate change is our opportunity to work for a fairer and more just world. In designing the global response to climate change, we have an opportunity to eradicate extreme poverty, ensure access to clean energy for all, and achieve equitable access to sustainable development. I believe a zero-carbon, climate-resilient pathway to prosperity is more likely to support the right of developing countries to develop than business as usual. Carbon would ultimately constrain development in the least developed and most vulnerable nations of the world, as climate impacts lead to more poverty and greater inequality. In a transition to zero carbon and zero poverty, on the other hand, the potential benefits outweigh the risks, with the opportunities for developed and developing countries in terms of energy security, greater competitiveness, better health, decreased mortality, job creation, and greater resilience. The fifth assessment report of the IPCC identified the links between climate change and sustainable development. It reminds us that sustainable development is development that preserves the interests of future generations, that preserves the ecosystem services on which continued human flourishing depends, and that harmonises economic, social, and environmental development. It adds that, and I quote from the report, "The climate threat constrains possible development paths, and sufficiently disruptive climate change could preclude any prospect for a sustainable future. Thus, a stable climate is one component of sustainable development." Now, remember I reminded you at the very beginning that I am importantly a grandmother, so of course I deal with intergenerational justice. Fourthly, a climate justice approach preserves the interests of future generations through intergenerational justice. Climate change is a fundamental problem that we must solve and not merely pass on to the generations to come. The words of the ancient proverb come to mind. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. We have a responsibility to them. We can't let our children and grandchildren look back on this critical period in time and say that we failed them. Research commissioned by my foundation indicates that the establishment of a commission for future generations at the international level could play a role in balancing the needs of current and future generations. For example, by monitoring the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Climate Agreement to ensure that adequate progress is being made to protect the rights of future generations. 20 years ago, most of us were not as aware of the issue of climate change as we are today. We need to recognise how much power we have over those who are yet to come, and we must use that power equitably. And that's why I am delighted to see in the audience, and I think in the audience in the other room, so many young people here today. And we need to hear your voices, as we heard from Amy and from Andrew, and that wonderful poem from Elise. As leaders and elders, we have a responsibility to empower young people to participate in decision-making processes that shape their future. I'm glad that young people are getting involved and taking up the banner. At the Climate March in New York last September, I saw lots of youth groups out marching for change. Supported by the work of Bill McKibben and the 350.org, we see large numbers of students getting involved in divestment campaigns and a call for a more just society. The world needs you to show this transformative leadership, to make the world a more just place to live. At that Climate March last September, I was walking with Gru Brundtland, another elder, and we were with a group with elders' banners. And then I saw another banner just a little bit away, but with a big crowd I couldn't go over there. And on that other banner was the strong message, "Angry Grannies." And I thought that's what's needed. 2005 presents the world with a significant opportunity to ensure that we deliver a new pathway to the future. Next month, leaders will gather in Addis Ababa for the 3rd International Conference on Financing for Development. In September, in New York, deliberations will conclude on a new set of sustainable development goals for all countries, which will be adopted by a special summit. Following this will be the adoption of the new climate agreement in Paris in December. The coming together of these processes creates a unique opportunity to stabilise our climate and transform the lives of billions of people. For this to happen, a robust set of agreements must be adopted, which guarantee a pathway to end extreme poverty, to reduce inequality, and to minimise the risks posed to development from climate change. The release of Laudate Si, Care for Our Common Home last week is very timely, not just for this conference, but in mobilising support for a climate justice approach to these processes during this year. The encyclical is a call for climate justice from one of the most influential moral voices on our planet today. In it, Pope Francis shows his profound understanding of the connection between nature, justice for the poor, human dignity, and the need to act in solidarity in the face of climate change. Above all else, Pope Francis establishes climate change and safeguarding the earth for humanity as a fundamental moral issue of our time. At the end of his encyclical, Pope Francis points to hope with these encouraging words. Let us sing as we go. May our struggles and our concern for this planet never take away the joy of our hope. I'm also hopeful. We have a great opportunity this year. We understand the problem and we know what needs to be done. The opportunity of this year brings to mind what I think will be very familiar words of a great Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, taken from the Cure at Troy. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. We have to mobilise that tidal wave of justice this year in order to lift the ambitions of all countries to do more and to generate that sense of human solidarity which is fundamental to our shared future. And I believe this conference is making a very good start on that tidal wave of justice. Thank you very much.